This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton here with my co-host Max Blumenthal. And today we are talking about some tragic news, the historic defeat of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party in the general election in the United Kingdom. And this was a shocker to many people. And we'll talk about today why Labour lost. It actually lost quite a few seats. And the Tories it looks like they're going to be in power for likely the next 5 years. Specifically, Labour lost 59 seats. And we'll talk about why they lost those seats. But of course, one of the major issues is going to be Brexit. So we'll talk about the endless media campaign to attack and destroy Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, but also the kind of historic mistake of Labour flip-flopping on this crucial question of Brexit. And to discuss this today, we are joined by someone who has been vindicated, a Labour Party activist who for years now has actually been calling for a progressive left-wing Brexit. I'm talking about Joshua Jackson. He is a Labour Party activist and also was the campaign coordinator for Ellsbury. Thanks for joining us, Josh.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, Josh, let's just start with this question. Why do you think Labour lost? And maybe can you talk about whether or not you think Brexit was either the central issue or one of the central issues? Because it's something that you've been, screaming at the top of your lungs about now for over a year.
Yes, well, I think let's absolutely set the stage. As you started out by saying, a historic defeat. We can make no illusions about that. I just want to illustrate it by pointing to one seat in particular, the seat of Bolsover, in which the MP there was a man named Dennis Skinner. And for 49 years, he had been the MP. This is a working class man. He was a miner. He was down the pits. He fought against Thatcher during the miners' strike, and he has been an ardent socialist. And if you want to talk about anyone who was well known and well liked in his seat, it was him. And he has been someone who also supported Brexit, supported leaving the EU, but he lost his seat by over 5,000 votes. A Tory to the party which had decimated his community and decimated the working class population there. And these people did not vote against Dennis because they had suddenly decided, they don't, like him anymore. They don't like, socialism or anything like that. It was because simply Brexit. And we cannot escape this fact that in 2016, Britain underwent the largest democratic vote in history. It voted to leave. And this wasn't just a vote which was, any particular way. It was a very class correlated vote. 2/3 of the working class voted to leave, and a vast majority of these people were concentrated in Labour constituencies. Now, in 2017, we stood on a platform in that snap general election against Theresa May, saying that we would respect the outcome and that we'd implement a Brexit deal in line with Labour's transformative manifesto to nationalise large parts of the economy and change the relationship, or some of the relationships, in British capitalism. And in the years since then, unfortunately, we begun to backslide on that position, and we began to make it clear that actually Labour would go back on what it said of implementing the result and have a second referendum. And I think it's probably the most catastrophic decision that the Labour Party has made since the Iraq War. And it's a funny, very coincidence, because the same people who wanted us to go to war in Iraq were those who pushed this second referendum line. People like Alistair Campbell, Peter Mandelson, even Tony Blair himself came out and said, the only way if it backs the second referendum. And I think we have to recognize that this defeat has been a long time coming. It wasn't just when the policy was sort of officially announced, but it was every sort of kind of wink and nod towards this Remain crowd and what was actually already a minority position of the losing, that we would not actually go through with implementing the result and that we would go back on it. So I think virtually almost all of the seats that Labour lost were Leave seats. These were seats with large working class populations, some seats which have been held for over a century. So we cannot shy away, and some people are already starting to come up with so many different reasons. Some people are saying it was because, it was just older voters. Some people are even saying it's because the electorate was racist or ridiculous things like that, even, Russia type conspiracies. Yet we cannot escape the fundamental fact that the seats we lost were leave voting seats. And a large proportion of Labour voters either stayed at home, voted for the Tories, or went elsewhere. So we absolutely have to face up to the Brexit.
Yeah, the specific numbers on that are 59 seats were lost by Labour, and of those, 5 were lost to the Scottish National Party, the SNP. And, that's a more complex thing. We'll talk about Scotland. But of the other seats lost by Labour, the other 54 seats within the UK, 52 of them were in districts where people voted to leave, and only 2 of the 54 seats that Labour lost were areas where they voted to remain. So that's extremely compelling evidence right there. I mean, they're basically saying that virtually all of the seats outside of Scotland that Labour lost, excluding these 2 small exceptions, but basically more than 96% of them were in districts where people voted to leave. I mean, that's just, that's as clear as evidence gets.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the writer Jack Donahue did a really good thread on Twitter looking through some of the constituencies that Labour has held for decades and that it lost in this election. So Blythe Valley, Labour had held since 1950, it lost to the Tories. Workington, Labour had held since 1918, also lost to the Conservatives. So there are so many examples of this. Wrexham, Leigh, all of these constituencies. And it just shows that because Labour took this position of really neither nor against Brexit, alienating really anyone for or against Brexit, it completely led to their defeat.
That's what we would call the red wall,
which
Labour has held for 100 years, as you said. Those are the Labour heavy seats. These are the, what you would call it in the U.S., yellow dog Democrats, who are like, working class whites. Some of them stretched across the South and the Rust Belt, and they say they'd vote for a yellow dog before they voted for a Republican. And Donald Trump won a lot of them over by condemning NAFTA and free trade, for example, and the interventionist policies of the Democrats. Jeremy Corbyn seemed although he's from North London and he surrounded himself with a lot of people from that kind of social and cultural milieu, he seemed to understand the working class politics of those districts, and he was a Eurosceptic. Am I right? He was a Eurosceptic for his whole political life. So what do we know about the thinking that went into him supporting the people's vote, which was, as you mentioned, to re-vote a new vote on Brexit 6 months after the election, which just seemed like such a harebrained scheme. What do we know about the factors that convinced him to take that step?
Well, I think, firstly, you're absolutely right. Jeremy Corbyn historically has been a Eurosceptic. He voted against the Treaty of Maastricht, and sort of his, what you might call, political idol mentor, Tony Benn, was a sort of a legend of the Labour left. And he was someone also long opposed to the European Union, had always been seen as sort of a neoliberal club, sort of an alliance of bankers, bosses throughout Europe, which sort of entrenched much of what Thatcher did. And he and people like John McDonnell even had been opposed to that. But you are right, there was an almost Damascene conversion within the last years to, instead of talking about the deficiencies of the EU, why it actually may be justified to leave, instead pivoting towards remain. And I think there's a few reasons to this. I think, firstly, because the position that Jeremy Corbyn was in during the actual referendum itself, right then, he was not in the strongest of positions. It was before election, and his cabinet, his shadow cabinet, was made up of much of the people who had opposed him, people who had been undermining him for a long time. And there was really no sort of what you might call a socialist space within the party for him to put out a more Eurosceptic position without there being a split. And this has always been the thing on the Labour left. It's what Tony Benn faced as well. It's what Jeremy Corbyn particularly faced. The question of party sort of want to keep, the fundamental task is keeping the party together. And if we ever want to win, we have to keep the party together. This is sort of the line which we've been kind of fed. And I think that has informed more than anything Jeremy Corbyn's pivot, because what we were told within the last few months is that if we don't back a second referendum, and some people even want to go further than that and just say we should be wholesale Remain, what they said is that the party would split, would have people abandoning us for the Liberals, would, never win another election again. And I think, Jeremy was surrounded by, and most Labour MPs are Remainers, and a lot of these people represent Leave seats, but they're Remainers themselves. And he's surrounded by a lot of these people who were repeating the same line. They were like, it's going to be a disaster if we don't back Remain. It's going to be, we're going to lose to Liberal Democrats. And in sort of what you might call the wider left, a lot of our base is more what you might call perhaps middle class activists, more kind of graduate types, as opposed to, ordinary working class people. Is that the voices of some individuals on what you might call more the media, people such as Owen Jones, Paul Mason, these kind of figures had more influence, more vocality than obviously the ordinary person on the doorstep who doesn't have access to, the Labour leadership team and Labour offices and such things. So what, Jeremy Corbyn was hearing all the time from these people, even from some of his closest advisors, people like John McDonnell even, was that Labour is going to lose if it does not back a second referendum. And this had been just a push which had been going on and on constantly, and a very well-funded campaign as well. The People's Vote campaign was funded by, liberal billionaires. And unfortunately, there was nothing on the left to match this. And I think this is certainly one of the criticisms that I can make of our side, is that there wasn't sort of a Eurosceptic campaign, which was, to say, well-funded as the one to reverse referendum, because that campaign, which was effectively a continuity of the 2016 Remain campaign, it was very well-funded, very well organized. And it obviously, as I said, is of people like Peter Mandelson, Alistair Campbell, even Tony Blair, and all of these such things. So Jeremy Corbyn had pressure on all sides. Much of the left had still sort of bought into this idea. And I think this is one of the fatal ideas, that Remain was inherently good and progressive. So to support Remain was to supposedly support progress, to support all of these good things. And I think it was that sort of identity view of the Brexit vote which placed sort of Leave as being, a lot of like racist, fascist, all sorts of things, and Remain being sort of like good internationalist, whereas actually the actual material reality is very different. And I think because we were never allowed to properly, or Corbyn was never allowed to properly articulate membership, a lot of people just bought into this idea that we were always told that, we have to support Remain, where even something which I always hated hearing, that Labour is a Remain party, and Remain suddenly became, a byword for all of these good values. Whereas instead of talking about social and the working class, we extended everything through this prism of Remain. So I think Jeremy was, and I think unfortunately, although a very honourable man, certainly correct about, his answers to the problems in Britain and British capitalism, his manifesto was very good. It was very radical. His own leadership style was one of conciliation, and it was a sort of, he tried to unify people, which of course is admirable, but you can't, and what I would have always said is that you can't unify with people who firstly want to destroy you, want to see that your leadership is completely destroyed, and you also can't unify with people who are defying the will of the majority, because that's never going to be a path to victory through the minority position of the losing side of a referendum. So I think really Jeremy had no base truly to which to resist this. And I think in his own personal leadership style, it was never going to be within him to put his foot down and say, absolutely not. And I think that really hurt us.
Can I ask you to just expand a little bit on the issue of Brexit and class politics? Because we have a lot of viewers and listeners who are from the US or from outside of Europe and who may not understand the issue. And I think there's an issue of political education here, because first of all, Brexit was indeed sold to the British public by UKIP, which is now the Brexit party of Nigel Farage, in a racist and anti-refugee, Islamophobic manner. The refugees are coming and they're going to take your pensions, and the EU is going to bring them over here.
Well, but don't forget, Max, but then they also, UKIP at the same time, even though these are the same people who are moving toward the privatization of the NHS, they also said that if you stay in the EU, there was going to be more and more cuts to the NHS. So they sent the bus around saying, save the NHS.
Yeah, well, and the EU was mandating cuts. So that's what I kind of want you to get into, is why so many working people in traditional labor constituencies wanted Brexit, because I think the way it's understood here in the West is that Brexit was an entirely right-wing racist campaign. And how would it have been possible to articulate a Lexit or a kind of people's Brexit from someone like Corbyn? Just explain the politics of Brexit.
Oh, of course. So I think when we look at where the Leave vote was most concentrated, and particularly these correlates, a lot of this is what you kind of call the post-industrial towns, also the coastlines, places which once upon a time had been booming centers of British industry. They were, they had steel, they had built automobiles, all of these sorts of things. The people there were reasonably well off, or at least, they were highly skilled working class. They had jobs, they had stability. But for the last 40 years, since Margaret Thatcher effectively decimated British industry, crushed the most militant aspects of our trade union movement, these places had seen declining living standards and declining prospects for so long. And the working class people who used to, make their life's blood out of all of this industry saw so much of it be taken away. Much of it went either to Europe or further afield, and there was nothing which ever replaced it. What replaced it was sort of kind of, like service jobs, things which did not make use of the skills that these communities had. And I think the EU, for these people, had never been a presence in their lives, whereas there'd been if you're in a more sort of affluent area and you've been making use of, say, EU's freedom of movement to, get jobs on the continent and all these things, for people who were in these very deprived areas, they had been abandoned both by the Tories and by New Labour. So when, they were presented with the prospect of Remain, and let's not forget the Remain campaign was actually led by David Cameron and George Osborne, the people who had implemented austerity, which had caused so much damage to these working class areas. A lot of people either saw the vote to Leave as a vote against the politics of David Cameron and the Tony Blair and all of these people who were telling them to remain, and as something different. Of course, there were the Nigel Farages who did use the demand for Brexit and sort of, ideas about sovereignty as a back channel for more reactionary views. But I think what sort of cut through the most was that slowing back control, which really spoke to the absence of genuine control that the working class in these areas had over their life, that these people could do to stop the declines of their homes, their industry, and their livelihoods. They couldn't stop Thatcher. They couldn't stop out of their public services under the Tories and New Labour as well. And I think, Brexit to them at least offered them a chance to have their voice heard. So I think that was part of the motivation behind it. I think, the left opposition to the European Union has always been rooted in the understanding of what the function of the EU, in that the EU is sort of the structural manifestation of neoliberalism. It institutionalizes it. If you look at the Treaty of Maastricht, one thing which every country has to sign up to is, quote unquote, an open market economy with free competition. So already that's going against necessary for any successful labor or socialist movement by having common ownership, monopoly in industry, by actually having planning. And obviously in the EU, we've seen, competition in areas such as in healthcare. So they mandate competition in healthcare. So we have to open up health contracts to private bidders.
Essentially forbids development along socialist lines.
Exactly. However, because sort of embrace of Europe happened in sort of the 90s and 2000s, when we had sort of development of New Labour, a lot of these arguments and people who would have argued against it were effectively signed by, sort of like Blairites and liberals within the Labour Party. And the argument for leave Euroscepticism was completely pushed to the wayside. And it was seen as like a minority position, sort of like a crank position. And therefore, like, it was the right who was able to capitalize on the grounds of Euroscepticism and play into fears of xenophobia. And I mean, even, I think there was a lot of confusion about what actual sort of EU immigration rules are, but it's not part of what they call the Schengen zone. So we still have passport checks. And, a lot of the complaints about immigration was actually about outside of the European Union, because obviously people, I think a lot of racism is more directed towards, like Muslims, people of color, as opposed to actually just sort of a lot of European immigrants themselves. And so much of it was confused and just put forward in a very sort of simplistic way. But I think that shouldn't detract from what a core demand was about sovereignty, about being able to make decisions in our own country. And that's something which I think the left didn't really understand. They didn't really understand that demand at the time, to wanting to have that control. And I think what socialists should have done was link that into our demands, that we do want to be able to actually make decisions about our own economic policy, about our own foreign policy. We don't want to be locked into the EU model of development along sort of, neoliberal lines, along capitalist lines. We do want to actually do something different. And I think in 2017, we did make a good case about saying we want to transform the country, and we also accept the result, and we're tying these two things into a more open path. We can go beyond the limits of the European Union in areas such as rail. We can have a monopoly on rail. We can have a monopoly on energy, a monopoly on industry and energy, and these things which would not have been, or would have at least faced several hurdles and loophole, or like barriers within the European Union. And I think we just didn't articulate that enough. And why didn't we articulate it? It goes back to what I was saying, is that much of that Eurosceptic wing, the sort of Tony Benns, simply either, in the case of Tony Benn, was no longer around by 2016, or just that wing was so marginalized and utterly crushed by what was still a very liberal party, even in 2015, 2016, that there was really no way to articulate it. However, I think that there still was room for a compromise, which is what I think Jeremy Corbyn at least did in 2017, saying that we're going to leave, but we'll leave in a Labour deal which keeps us in, of the European Union, keeps us in some of those structures, to sort of, find a halfway point between kind of leaving, but having at least sort of one foot in the door, which of course is not necessarily a perfect position, but it at least respects a lot of what was voted for and recognises that. And I think it was that undoing and dragging us even further and further back into the structures of the European Union, which really in the long run.
Yeah, and I think your argument that there has definitely been this kind of working class base behind Brexit is confirmed simply if you look at the results. And, Max mentioned that Nigel Farage helped to lead the campaign initially for Brexit. But if you actually look at the results, the Brexit party was completely destroyed. They got 0 seats. They got less than 2% of the vote. So clearly, you're right that there was widespread support for Brexit. Now you could argue that maybe Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson share a lot of political similarities, and people supported Boris over him. But my question I'm more interested in exploring is, you mentioned that there was a left wing inside Labour who was pushing for a Lexit, right? A left wing Brexit, and that you mentioned that kind of media figures, The Guardian. I mean, when they weren't just viciously attacking Corbyn, they were even more viciously attacking Lexiteers, folks on the left who supported Brexit. You were one of those people, and you've been vindicated. And I think you should kind of take a victory lap here. And maybe could you just talk about who some of the people were pushing for a left-wing Brexit and what the attacks you faced were? Because
it's kind of a tragic victory lap.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is, Yeah, of course, tragic. But, well, I'm just saying, of course, when you look at things with 2020 hindsight, it's easy. But looking back at it, there are so many signs. I have up here a YouGov poll. This is one of the most recent polls. This is from January of this year. And it looks at the favorability tracker of Corbyn. And in the 2017 election, Labor won many seats and broke records. People didn't, a lot of the pollsters said Labor would lose seats. And that was, of course, when Labor supported honoring the referendum and essentially leaving the European Union. But this YouGov poll found, it's titled, "Brexit Indecisiveness is Seriously Damaging Corbyn." Again, this is from January. And it shows, you can see, and there's a graph here, and it just shows that his approval rating plummeted since the 2017 elections, when Labor took the position of supporting the referendum. So, it seems to me that clearly, like you said, there are a lot of these folks saying we have to support Remain. But even if you just looked at some of the polling, just some of the science, and ignored some of these media types, I think it was pretty clear that people were angry about the fact that Labor took this position on Brexit of having your cake and eating it too, of saying, well, we're not against leave, but also we're not against Remain. And everyone knew that they were actually pushing a soft Remain.
Yes, so I think elements to what you said, I think I'll just go back to the first about, obviously being vindicated. I think it is a sort of tragic vindication, because obviously now so many working class people will suffer under what will be the largest Tory majority since Thatcher. And what I'm sort of hoping and praying is that the lessons will be learned. And I think now, obviously, going on to what you also said about, the kind of figures pushing this, it was figures who were, and I think one thing that Corbyn has done is he's created this kind of sort of gallery of sort of media outliers, some of whom are in The Guardian, some of whom are in sort of new left media, kind of like sort of Novara media. I don't know if that's something which people might know of, but things which have kind of raised up some sort of voices. And these voices are people on the left, but they come from more middle-class backgrounds, more academic backgrounds. And I think the problem here is that there is a fundamental disconnect between a lot of the top of the party and the voter base, and in between there are the activists themselves, some of whom are working class, some of them are middle class. And I think what Corbyn did is he attracted a lot of students, a lot of people who have left-wing politics, but not necessarily working class politics. So I think that, what we had were a lot of people who were looking, for their sort of politics. They were looking more to The Guardian, to the New Statesman, to some of this kind of new left media. And what this new left media and places like The Guardian were telling them is that, Labour was in danger of losing voters to the Liberal Democrats. This was sort of the big fear. And it was like, we're going to lose to Liberal Democrats, or we're going to lose to there was this kind of group of Labour MPs on the right, on the centre, who sort of split from the party and formed this ultra sort of centrist party called Change UK. It was the independent group at one time, but they changed their name several times. And these people and the Liberal Democrats stood in the European elections before the general, and they completely lost to the Brexit Party. So the Brexit Party won the European elections, and this sort of small sect of ultra sort of centrists under the banner of Change UK were almost completely wiped out.
The alt center, if you will. They call us the alt left, or the alt center.
The alt center. Yet still there was this hysteria, because Labour also did not do well in the European elections, mainly because it did see like another sort of referendum on Brexit, sort of like an unofficial one. And there was this hysteria from the right and the centre of the party that our biggest danger was not losing Leave voters to the Tories, because some people just imagined that these assumed that they would never back anyone but Labour. But what they worried about was a lot of the kind of, middle classes leaving Labour and going to the Liberal Democrats. And people were predicting there would be a massive Liberal Democrat surge, because people, for some reason, and this was never backed up by any polling, but they imagined that people actually wanted to remain in the EU. They were telling us, and we saw all sorts of kind of polls which were based on very dubious data, that people wanted a second referendum, people wanted to remain. So this had became sort of a feedback loop, and it was going for The Guardian to activists, to new left media, and eventually sort of the leadership was encircled within people kind of called the Labour Party to back a second referendum. Some, as I said, even wanted to go further than that. And you had people like Owen Jones, and obviously I don't dislike Owen. The things that I would say about this kind of, the trend he sort of represents is a very fickle trend, because when they saw a bad poll or the signs of that things maybe might not go well for us, they were like, oh, we have to completely change course. They were like, look at one bad, local election result, European election result, that suddenly that justifies that we have to go all the way to backing a second referendum and completely going back on what we had actually stood on. The only verified successful result we had, which was nearly 40% of the vote in 2017 on a respecting Brexit platform, which in later polls went up to 45%. That was the only hard actual proof that we had was successful. But instead, we took what were very small results in either local elections or the European elections, which historically have never actually meant much in terms of what the actual general election result would be, and took those to mean something serious. So we have a lot of these people writing their Guardian columns saying Labour will be 20 points ahead if it backs Remain. Labour will be 20 points ahead if it's a second referendum. And we had all of these kind of stunts and pushes by figures who had always been backed up by a lot of figures who had been opposed to Corbyn, had been opposed to his idea of what the Labour Party should be. Also joining in this kind of sort of alliance between what you might call the soft left and sort of the right, saying that the only way we can win is if we appeal to Remainers, is if we appeal, because they assume that these people were all kind of progressive and that, they would just back Labour if we were Remain. Completely lost touch with obviously what the view was in Leave constituencies. And I think that really hurt. And it was, we were being fed this narrative by Remainers and the most influential Remainers that the only way we could win a general election was by backing a second referendum, but forgot that actually we were alienating in the process when we were appealing to all of these people, mainly based in cities, in more metropolitan areas. We were forgetting about all those who we would absolutely have to win in a future general election.
I want to slightly shift subjects, but I think it's relevant to you, to your discussion of the soft left and these kind of Guardian and New Statesman pundits who Corbyn cultivated as allies and really relied on to have a voice in mainstream media. And also, the role of momentum. For those who don't know what momentum is, it's kind of like Corbyn's version of Bernie Sanders for America, the kind of organized movement behind him. And there's an overlap between these pundits and momentum, supporting the Remain position, absolutely. And also kind of caving in and giving a lot of credence to this phony anti-Semitism campaign. And so you would constantly, I think Momentum put out a training guide for labor activists on how to, be nice to Jews, as if, they had this widespread problem where people in labor couldn't stop running around with spray paint cans, painting swastikas on synagogues or something. And Owen Jones was saying, the only proper thing to do is to apologize for this. And after 2017, when Corbyn was sort of, he came out swinging against the media, but he continued to maintain some of the same media alliances, and he was not ruthless with people within labor who were trying to destroy him. Dame Hodge, wasn't she the chair of Labor Friends of Israel? She won her seat, and Chris Williamson, who was drummed out for calling this witch hunt what it was, he didn't get defended by Corbyn. So, who stands to blame here? It's obvious, you have the Jonathan Friedlands at The Guardian who are just like vicious attack dogs, Zionist fanatics. But then you have this whole other element that played the same role as the Remainers played, which is to convince Corbyn to go against his whole career and his instincts of supporting Palestine and just being who he was. So what kind of a factor was this here?
I think there are a few elements to this. I think the first thing I think about when we talk about, which was the most comprehensive media campaign against in modern history, the level of the smears to try and convince people that the most anti-racist Labour leader in British a racist and anti-Semite. I think the blame for this, of course, we always knew that the right would put forward these smears because they fear Jeremy Corbyn. They fear that that the changes that he's going to make to Britain and will effectively, obviously, their livelihoods of exploitation and such things. But I think a lot of the problem lies with what I call sort of soft left supporters who say that they support Corbyn, but I think did not take the critical eye into a lot of these smears that they could have done. So when a lot of these accusations were made, I think the first instinct was to sort of reflex, to be like, oh, we absolutely, sort of like, oh, we'll do whatever it takes to kind of racist, and obviously there were a lot of these demands from, the right saying, all right, we, then you sort of have to kind of renounce your support for, a lot of these things about. There's a massive thing about accepting one particular definition of anti-Semitism, which effectively, made it very hard to discuss issues of Israel and Palestine without sort of falling under this kind of, banner of, if you say certain things and you'll be misconstrued as an anti-Semite. And a lot of people were unfortunately, obviously well-meaning, obviously wanting to show that we're absolutely not anti-Semitic, that we reject this, but going too far in acquiescence to demands that were not designed to make Labour a sort of an anti-racist party, but were actually designed to discredit Corbyn, to make him look like that his career had effectively been wrong, that he had been wrong in the past, to speak out against so many injustices which are currently being perpetrated. And a lot of people just felt that they had to make some sort of, a statement about. In fact, when you look at the origins of a lot of these claims, they come from people who had always been opposed to Corbyn, people who you could never say that about racism. If you want to talk about, where a lot of these claims came from, people like, like the right wing of the Labour Party, the same people who had sort of backed the Iraq War, destroyed countless sort of, brown countries with, Muslim populations, that these people were not serious anti-racists at all, because they have been engaged in racism for most of their political careers. But I think, stick, which we never truly learned how to rebut, because even when we apologized, even when Corbyn had come out, he did actually, they said he never apologized, but he did. When he came out and said, I'm sorry for the hurt caused, what they simply said is, this was not enough. And it was never going to be enough for them, no matter what Corbyn did shortly leaving. It was never. What we ended up doing was we tried to find any way we could to kind of make the statement. And unfortunately, people effectively turned into kind of like a sort of sacrificial lamb for this, to sort of make it like, oh, we're tough on anti-Semitism, we're going to get rid of Chris Williamson, and obviously,
and also Jackie Walker, Ken Livingston. I mean, there are so many Corbyn allies who were just dragged through the mud and smeared and attacked. And I guess, I don't necessarily blame Corbyn, but he didn't defend them.
I think the thing to look at with that is that, by the logic of the right, since we got rid of all of these people, and virtually everyone who was actually accused of anti-Semitism, of which there was, say, the slightest evidence, was basically expelled. So all of them were either expelled or suspended, but the claims never actually stopped. There was still no indication that, people would accept that Jeremy was, in fact, not an anti-Semite. And I think Jeremy's position was very, very, very difficult, because you had, and it would have seemed this way, that if you were sort of because he was sort of caught in between a rock and a hard place. You had the pull from the right saying that, you have to apologize, that, Labour, they're like, oh, Labour's been an anti-racist party all my whole career, but now that Jeremy's come along, it's awful now. So I think saying things like that. But on the left, you also had, we have to be tough against racism. And of course, we do want to be tough against racism. Yet it was actually, making it look like that there was a special problem with racism that Jeremy Corbyn had, whereas that was completely the opposite. And I think it was that notion that Labour had a special, Jewish people, which, and of course, which was completely wrong. Of course, anti-Semitism does exist, but the levels of it in the lower, only 0.01% of members had ever had anything accused about them. And that's much lower in society than society itself, and even in the Tory party. So I think it was just this idea that there was a special problem, which I think racist. I think he would have obviously assumed that, this can't stand it. He obviously wants to change it. But I think, he struggled to articulate a way to do that, which did not give in to ground. And that, in fact, even made him look even more sort of guilty when he was effectively acquiescing to people who were very much on the right, very much against him.
All right, we're going to take a pause there. That was part one of our discussion with the Labour Party activist Joshua Jackson. And the second part of this interview, we're going to keep talking about the historic loss of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party in Britain. And in part two, we're going to talk about the role of the media in vicious media attacks. The entire corporate media waged a disinformation campaign backed by British and American intelligence agencies to try to destroy Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. And of course, they successfully did so. So please join us in part two at Moderate Rebels. You can support this show at Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Moderate Rebels. And thanks for listening.